So yesterday we started with React hooks, so functional components with use state hook, and so let's move with effect. So there is use effect hook also. So just like use state, we have use effect hook. So these are just functions, normal functions. So you can also create your own custom hook that we'll see later. So now we'll go to use effect. So these are the most popular hooks. Can use effect. So it requires two things. So first is a function, and second is an optional list of dependencies. So it's an array where you specify list of dependency like variables. So let's say this counter, I can provide name. So this is a list of dependency. This is a function. So this will be executed. So when if you don't pass anything to this particular array, second argument of this use effect, then this will be executed only once when the component is mounted. So if I refresh, you can see mounted is printed, and anytime later that state changes, this will not be executed. So this will just act like a component did mount when you don't have any dependency. But when you have dependency, let's say counter. So whenever that dependency changes, this code will get executed. So now initially we'll see that mounted. So even though you have added this counter, it will still execute this code initially also. And after that, every time the counter changes, this code function will again execute. So every time counter is executed, I am able to get that value. You can also print that counter value. So counter is a direct variable, so you don't need this here. So in class component, we always use this. So you can see whatever is updated value, you get that value. So whenever the counter changes, this effect will run again. So use effect is used to perform some side effects like making some API call, accessing DOM elements, or you want to add some event listener which you cannot add. So let's say this is on-click listener, event handler. I can directly add to button, but if I want to add an event listener to window object, so scroll event we have seen previously. If I want to add that, then you cannot add it here. So this is not a window, this is a div. So you can add that inside a use effect hook. So this use effect hook is used to execute some effect. So to perform some side effect. So what is side effect? Side effect is like making a API call, accessing some DOM elements, or you want to add some event listener. So if you see button, if I want to add event listener, I can add directly here on click, on double click. So you can see double click is there. So I can directly add. But if I want to add some window or document event listener, you can add that in a use effect hook. So these components, every time component re-renders, your app component will re-render. So if you see in the app component here inside the class component, so whenever you call set state, your app component will re-render. And what will get called, what will get executed is just the render method. So only the render method gets executed in class component when your component re-renders. In case of functional component, everything gets executed again. So if I have function, let's say I'm adding event listener, window dot add event listener, scroll. Let's say I create a event const handle scroll, and I can use this. So now this is a functional component, so you don't need to use this dot. So you can directly refer. And you one more thing is this is functional component, so you are using const. If you are using class component, you don't use const. So that's how you declare functions inside class. Directly use that function. So to avoid binding this, we are converting it to arrow function inside class component. But we normally write it like this, add count like this. So this is how we declare function in class component. If you are using any this here, this binding, so to avoid that this binding, we are using arrow function. So you don't have const here. So initially before this, you don't have const. If you add, that's an error. But in case of functional component, you need to add a const because this is a function and you are declaring function inside. So now this handle scroll, you can directly say access. You don't need to use this dot. This is no longer available inside functional component, like because this is arrow function. Arrow function don't have this binding. You can also declare this app component like this. So now inside this you have this context, but inside the arrow function you don't have this. So where this app is defined, that will be used as this, but you never need this inside functional component. You don't ever use that. So now I can directly access this and I can print that value, window dot scroll y position. So right now I don't have any content here to scroll, so I can add that. So now you can see I have the content. So when I scroll, you can see the scroll position y is 0, scroll, it should be scroll y. You can see when I scroll, you get that scroll position. So this is how you can add event listener. You need use effect for that. As I said, whenever app component re-render, when it renders, you whenever you change the state. So whenever I increment the counter, your app component re-render. So you can add console.log here, rendered. And if I filter it by render, every time your increment, your state changes and your app component re-render, and you get this render printed. You can see if you are using class component, you cannot add console.log outside. You have to add inside render or any of the event handler. In case of functional component, you can add console.log anywhere because this is a function. And this will be re-rendering. So whenever re-render happens, all your event handlers, whatever you have created, those gets created again. So on every re-render, all the code inside app component gets executed again. So all these use effects will also execute this, rendering also execute this, event handler will also recreate it. Whatever console.log you have, those will again re-executed. So that's why if you should not perform some complex calculation here directly outside, because that will block the rendering. Like it will take time to execute that code. So rendering will take some more time. So that's why you don't add this event listener outside. So you always add it directly inside the use effect. So this will always add that event listener on every re-render. I don't want to add it on every re-render. I want to create this event listener only once. So that's why we add it in use effect. So now this is also not correct. So every time counter changes, you are adding that event listener. So this is a extra work. Like you are doing the same thing. You have multiple event listeners added. Whenever the counter changes, you are adding this event listener. So this is the correct way. So you don't have any dependency. So that event listener will only be added once. So if I scroll on event, add event listener, scroll, you are adding this, scroll y, window dot scroll y effect. Let me run. Oh, here we are filtering by render. So you can see this is getting executed. So this event listener is added only once. But when I add this will always be added. So every time count changes, you are creating new event listener, which is not a good thing. So you can see you have so many event listeners. So you have two event listeners. It's printing two times. If I increment it again, if I scroll, you can see you have three event listeners. So it's printing three times. So which is not a good thing. So every time I scroll, you have three console.log. So you have three event listeners. So what you can do is in use effect, you can also return a function. So from use effect, you can only return a function. You cannot return a string number. So that function will work as a cleanup function. So if I don't have any dependency, then this code will execute when this app component is unmounted. So just like component will unmount. So I can say app unmounted. So let me create component, another component. Let's create it inside here. Const counter. So I can unmount that. I will move everything from here inside it. So we have counter, now I can use that counter component here. Just like a class component, we can use this counter component. So counter component just displays this text and it has this event. So let's add those counters also. Button. You can see this increment counter. This is coming from the counter app. So I can print here counter. Counter component. And if you scroll down here, you have another counter. So this is from app component. App component. So I have added event listener here. So every time this will be added only once. So let me remove if I have here. No, I have removed from here. So this will be executed when the counter component is mounted. So when you are this counter is mounted, when you are using it here inside. Let me move this inside separate component because this file is becoming larger. Components. Counter.js. Import use effect, import use state, and this is done. Remove this, import counter. So this is app component. You can see you are seeing this app component. Then I am printing this counter. So let me remove. So this is the counter component that you are displaying. I can increment. You see the counter is incremented. When I scroll, you see this particular scroll bar. So whatever scrolling happens, that event handler is getting executed. Now let me add new state. Set show use state false. And I will conditionally display this counter. So I can first display that value of show. So show is a boolean, so you need to convert it into string. So it will get displayed. And here I can say if show is true, then I will display that counter. So initially show is false. So you don't see that counter. So this is app component. So here I can print here div app component. So you can see this is app component. This all is rendering from app component. But when I toggle that show, so let me add button, toggle show, on click, set show. So how you change this state in class component, it's an object. So you just specify that object set state, you define object and you just specify that property. In this case, you can directly call set show with new value. So I can say false, I can say true, but I just want to toggle between true and false. So I will just take the previous like updater syntax. So in set state, if you are using this dot set state, in class component, we have this syntax also. So you get previous state and you return object with, let's say, counter, with counter with, let's say, this dot state dot counter plus 1. This is how you get that updater function of set state you use. Here also you can use that. So here you will get that previous state value and you can do return anything. So Previously with class component, it state is always object, so you return object. In this case, you get previous value of show, which is false. Now I want to set this show, so it's just direct boolean. So I can just return opposite of show. So you don't need to return object because this is not object. This is a boolean value. So you can directly return. You can say implicit return. So if you want, you can directly return like this. So this is longer syntax. So this is a function that you have written which returns opposite of this. Let me remove this. So when I toggle show, you can see it's changing from true to false, false to true. This is working. But if you have just single statement inside any function, you can use implicit return syntax of arrow function. So I can just say not show. So this will update. So now by default show is false. So you don't see the counter component. When I make it true, you can see now you see this counter component increment. All this is coming from counter. Then you have below app component. Now I can unmount this component. So how can I unmount it? So when show is false, so here we are added condition. When show is true, then only we are calling this counter. And inside this we have app. Here it should be counter unmounted. So as I said, use effect, from use effect you can return a function. That function will get executed when the component unmounts. So when it's removed from the DOM, when it's removed from the UI, it's not displayed. At that time that function will get called. So I can, right now it's not displayed, I can make it display. So now counter is displayed. You can see it's printing mounted and render is printed. But if I make it toggle again, so show will become false. And if it's false, then we are not showing that counter. So when I make it toggle show, you can see counter unmounted you get. When I toggle it again, it's again get rendered. When I toggle, it's again unmounted. So this code is executed whenever you return a function from use effect hook, that will execute just like a component will unmount. So it will be executed when your component unmounts, before your component unmounts. So now we also added this counter previously. So every time the counter changes, you are adding event listener. So you can add that event, remove that event listener here. Window dot remove event listener, scroll and handle scroll. Now what is, this is not an issue. So let me first comment out this and show you. When I increment, this is counter. Let me increment toggle show. Yes, so you can see this counter unmounted, mounted is printed, counter unmounted, mounted, scroll position. So when I scroll, you can see 4 times this event listener is added, because every time count changes, your event listener is added. So initially, at the initial time, this use effect is executed. So you add this event listener. After 3 times you have clicked that event, so toggle counter is now 3. So you have clicked increment 3 times. So it has added that event listener again 3 times. So it's 4 times. But if I add this code to remove that event listener, now if I toggle show, increment, scroll, you can see it's only 1. If I increment, I have incremented 8 times, but it's displaying only 1. Why? Because this cleanup function is executed every time before re-executing this effect. So if you don't add this dependency here, this function will only execute when counter component is unmounted. But if you add some dependency here, so whenever the dependency changes, this use effect function will execute. But before executing code from that function, first cleanup function will be executed. So what you are doing, so whenever the counter changes, you are removing that event listener and then you are again adding. So you have only 1 event listener added. So that's why you see counter unmounted first and then mounted. So I can show you again. So when I clear this, when I increment, you can see counter unmounted and then mounted. Again increment, counter unmounted and then mounted. So this code is executed first and then this code, whatever function code is there, that will be executed. So this is a good scenario. So just like a class component, you add component will unmount to remove any event listener. In this case, we are adding this function, returning function from use effect hook. So this is a function. From that function, we are returning a new function. You can also write it as a normal function. So this function you are returning. So whenever you return function from use effect, that will be called every time before executing this code if you have some dependence. So if I refresh this again, that normal function will also work. You can see if I scroll, you have only one event listener. It's not multiple events because before adding, you are removing that. So that's a good way. Now I can also declare date. Date, set date, use date. So new date. So current value of date. And I can display that date. Now date is object as you already know. So if I print this, you will get error. Objects are not valid. So I can say to local time string, that will give me a string where it is displayed. This is inside counter. First I need to click on. So this counter is displayed and it's permanent. It's not changing. So every time I refresh, I need to make this true and then it's showing. So what I can do, I can, where is counter? Show. Sign up. You can make it true initially. So initially itself that counter component will be displayed. So every time I refresh, you get that new value of date. But now I don't want to refresh that page. I want that counter to automatically update. So I can set that state. So where is counter? So I can add set interval here. So after every second, after every 1 second, I will set that state. Const date, new date, set date, date. If I can print that date. So this set interval, you can also use window.set interval, or you can directly use set interval. So now every 1 second you have that timer running, you are also printing. So every second you are setting state. So when you set state, your counter component will re-render and then you are displaying that value, like all the code execute again. So this use effect, whenever the counter changes, then only this will be executed. But this handles scroll event. Every time your component is re-rendered, this function will be again recreated. So all event handlers, if you have in your code any function that you declare inside functional component, will be recreated on every re-render. Because this is a normal function, you are again executing it multiple times. So now you are setting state and you are displaying this counter. Now if I unmount this counter, so if I toggle show, now counter component is no longer available. Still I am able to see this. So this is app component code. You don't have counter related code. So this is coming from app component. So here I am displaying counter component date. You can see date is not displaying here, but still your counter is going on. So your code is getting executed, which is known as memory leak. So when your component is no longer visible, no longer displayed on the UI, you should remove all the code from that. So this set interval, you can return a timer. So I can say interval. So it will return some value, which you can use to clear out that interval. So I can say clear interval and interval. Now every time counter changes or first time itself, when you add that event listener set interval, every time you are setting that interval, you are setting that state, so you will get updated value. And here you are clearing. So before counter changes, you are clearing that and then again you are adding. So if I don't do this, let me show you, refresh this counter component and I will increment this counter. So you can see this, there is a flash like it's executing multiple times. If I increment this, you can see it's increased. Why this is happening? Because every time counter changes, you are again resetting that interval, like you are recreating interval. So you have so many intervals you have created. So that's a memory leak. You are increasing your memory. You are adding this function inside memory to execute every time the counter changes. So you have, so 5 times you have clicked on increment, so you have 5 set intervals added, which is not a good thing. So before adding interval, you should clear that interval. So that's the advantage of this cleanup function. So before, whenever the counter changes, first this cleanup function will be executed. So if you have previous interval, that will be cleared, previous event listener, that will be removed. If you don't have that, that is not an issue. So it just try to remove. If it exists, it will be removed. And now this code will be executed, whatever inside this function, you are again recreating interval. So this is a better way. So now if I increment this, you can see you have only one interval. So if I, no matter how many times I increment, it's the same, it's not multiple flashes, because you have only one interval. And whenever I unmount this component, so as I said, this will be executed before re-executing this effect, also when the counter component unmount. So I can unmount this by toggling show. So how this counter is unmounted? Very app. So here I am adding conditional. So when show is true, that counter will be added, like it will be mounted, counter component will be displayed on the screen. And when it show is false, it's removed from the UI. So that is unmounting. So showing and hiding is like a mounting and unmounting. So all code will be executed again. So when I make show false, right now show is true. When I make it show false, you can see there is no log in the console for a date, because that component is unmounted and I have cleared out that interval. So before component unmounted, this interval is cleared. You can see counter unmounted is printed. Then you have removed that event listener, you have removed that interval. So this is a better way of writing code. Use effect hook. So use effect hook is used to perform some side effect, like adding an event listener or make an API call. So let's say I want to make API call. So I have this random user or JSON placeholder. We have already seen slash users will give me 10 users. I can access user by specific ID. So I have ID 1, 2, 3. When I say 2, I will get that ID. So I can make API call here. So do we have Axios installed? No. So to make API call, you can use fetch or Axios. Axios is better because it has better error handling. Now this is started. I can make API call. So not inside this counter, because yeah, I can make it here itself. I can say Axios import dot get that URL. So let's use template literal syntax dollar of counter. And this will return promise, so I can attach dot then. And result of Axios always comes in the data property. So I can say result dot data. So initially also that API call will be made, and you see this 0. So there is no user with 0 count. Let me make it 1. So you can see you get one user with ID 1. When I increment counter, now you are again making API call, you get user with ID 2. So let me remove that interval. It will not add so many consoles. So when I increment, you are making API call. Again, counter is 3, you are making API call to get that third user. So this is normal promise chain dot then, and whenever you add a dot then, you always need to add dot catch. So if the API fails or something goes wrong, your application will not break. So this is also working. Now this is not dot then dot catch. If what if I want to use async await? So if I try to use async here, as I said, for use effect hook, you pass a function. That function, if you declare async, you will get warning. So now I want to use this as async await. Let me comment this out. Const data equal to await axios dot get. I can use same URL. Now, as the result always comes in data property, I am directly destructuring and I can print data. So this line of code will only execute once this is successful. So await means it will wait until the promise gets resolved or rejected. So as we are using await, make sure to use try catch. So if something goes wrong, your program will not crash. So you can see there is a warning in the console. Use effect must not return anything beside a function. So as I said, use effect, from use effect, you can only return a function, and that function cannot be a async function. It should be normal function. You can see you are getting error. Destroy is not defined, something error is coming. And you have that error. So use effect must not return anything beside a function, which is used for cleanup. So you should always return normal function. So I cannot use this as async function. So you are getting this. So it will work like you are getting this working, you are getting, but you have warning. So destroy is not defined, and you have this warning of this warning, use effect must not return. So to avoid those errors, you can create a function here. I can say get user, and that function you can declare as async. Now I can move this inside this function, and I can call that user function. So now I have declared a function which I have marked as async. Inside that I have a synchronous code, and from this use effect I am just calling that get user function. So now if I refresh, I don't have any error. Increment, it's working perfectly without any error. So this is how you should use async await, and you should not directly write it here. If you don't want to create a separate function and then call it, you can use immediately invoked function expression, that is JavaScript way. So you define a function here and you mark it as async. So whatever you have code, you can directly write it here. I don't need here. So what I have done, I have created a function bracket, then I am calling that, and inside that I have created a function. So this is a function. So immediately after creating, I am calling that. So this is known as IIFE, immediately invoked function expression. So you can search for IIFE and you can read more information about. So it's just simple. You define a function and you immediately call that. So that's what we have done here. So we have defined a async function and we are immediately calling. So you don't need to create a function with some name and then call it separate. So this is also valid. So if you refresh, you can see it still works. When I increment, you still get that updated user. So this is also possible, and you can also define that function outside. So I can comment this out. I can move this use effect function outside use effect. Let me call this. So when I increment, you can see it still works. So you don't have to declare that function inside, but it's always better to declare that function inside, because if you are using some external variable, that will get that value. So it will have that updated value. So when I say increment, you get that user to. If you are using some external variable, so let's say right now this counter is directly available. So whenever you call this, you get this updated value. But if I am not using this counter here, what will happen? So now this code is executed only once when the component is mounted. So now this get user function is executed. And here I am having the counter value of 1. So on page load, you will get that API call. Now every time I increment, you can see you are not making that API call. It's not getting executed. So this get user is not getting executed. So because this is, you don't have any dependence. So this code will execute only when the increment counter is changed. So right now it's executing only once. So I need a dependency here. So every time the counter changes, this code will execute and it will have that updated counter value. So every time I call, you get that particular user fact. So that's it about use effect hook. Use effect is really useful, but you should avoid writing multiple use effect hook because use effect does not execute immediately. Use effect executes after the render. So once everything is rendered on the UI. So if I add here from use effect, so whenever possible, always I avoid using with use effect. And here I have rendered. So if I refresh, you will see rendered first and then from use effect is rendered. So every time I increment, you have rendered first, then counter unmounted and from use effect. So why it's happening? Because use effect hooks gets executed after the render, not immediately render. So once everything is ready, and if you are setting state here, so let's say I have const user set user equal to use state. So user is initially null. And here once I get that data, I will set it. So without this, let me show you. So you can find out how many times a component is rendered. So you can use console.count method. So it will print the count of how many times this code is executed. So anytime you want to execute if how many times a function is getting called, you can add console.log in console.count inside. So it will record how many times that is executed. So now you can see what I'm printing console.count rendered. So what is the value of rendered? It's 1. If I increment, you can see rendered is 3. So I have incremented 3 times. So app component is executed 3 times. If I execute 2 more times, it's 5. So now rendered is where it is. So I have refreshed. Let me show you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you have rendered 5. So 5 times app component is rendered. So every time state changes, your component is re-rendered. But now let's say I have this set state. So now if you see this counter is 6 and you are rendering this rendered 5. So let me show you again. So I have not saved this. Counter is 2, 3. So counter is 3, rendered is 3. So now if I set this state here, refresh this. Now counter make it 3 and how many times it's rendered? It's rendered 5 times. So what is happening? So every time you are setting state, your component will re-render. Here what you are doing, so every time the counter changes, you are executing this get user function. So every time get user is called, you are setting state. And whenever the state is set, your component will re-render again. So you have one extra re-render happening whenever you are setting state inside use effect. So this code is exactly like you are executing from use effect because you are calling get user and this get user function gets called only when the counter is changed because you have added as a dependence. So every time use effect runs, you are setting state. So once you set state, your component will re-render again. So initially it will render, your counter changes, again you say call the function, again you set state, again it will re-render. So you have one extra re-render happening every time counter changes. So if I don't add this set state, show you. So let me rendered filtered by rendered. So counter is initially 1. When I increment, you can see rendered is 2, 3, 4, 5. So now without that set state, I'm just calling this get user and that's fine. I'm not re-rendering component because I'm not setting state. So counter is 5 and I am re-rendering it 5 times. But if I set this state here, so what will happen every time use effect runs, you are again setting state, your component will again re-render. So now when I increment, you can see now counter is 2 and rendered is 4. Again increment, you are again re-rendering twice. So every time increment happens, your first component will re-render, whatever is there, updated counter will display, then you are making API call inside use effect. So use effect will always execute later. Then you are again setting state, again component will re-render. Like for every time you have one extra re-rendering happening, when you are setting state inside use effect. So that's why you should avoid using use effect. If you can avoid that, it's always good to avoid. You can have multiple use effect hooks. So you can have multiple use effect hooks. Another use effect, and all the use effects will execute one after the another. So here I am printing from use effect, and in second use effect I am printing another use effect. So if I refresh, clear this, so you can see from use effect, and then you have another use effect. Now this is, there is no dependency here, so this will not execute again and again. But if I change it, add a counter dependency, then this will execute again. So if I refresh this, so you can see from use effect, from another use effect. So let me filter it. When I increment this, you see from use effect, another use. So the order is always same. So each use effect will execute one after the another, and they will always execute after the initial render. And if you are having set state inside use effect, that will cause a one extra re-render. That's why you should avoid writing use effect. So what normally people will do is, let's say I have here, let me use bootstrap. React bootstrap. Can go to React bootstrap. So we have not used these components. We have written that contact manager app from scratch. So you will get better understanding of CSS. But now we'll use that bootstrap components. So I can search for forms. So I don't need to write all the code again. So let's say I have form here. So form is from React bootstrap. I have two components here, first name, last name. Type equal to text, first name, enter your first name. Last name. You can see these are looking like a normal because we have not imported the base bootstrap library, CSS. Bootstrap dist CSS bootstrap dot mean dot CSS. So this is from node modules. We have bootstrap. So now you can see, let me add container here. So we have class of container, which is bootstrap class. So there will be some spacing. So now you can see I have first name and last name. So when I change, I want to display that full name. So what usually people will do, developers do, so they declare state, first name, last, set first name, equal to use state, empty. Last name, set, last name, we have full name. So whenever I change this, on change for input, I set here, set first name. So it will be event dot target dot get. Copy this here, set last. Here, I'll display full name. So initially full name is empty because both of them are not there. So how I can get that full name value? So what usually people do is they will write it as a dependency. So whenever the first name or last name changes, set full name to first name plus last name. So full name is empty. You can type here Mike. You can see full name is getting printed, and this is also getting. But you can see every character type this is getting rendering. So if I type here Mike, you can see you have rendered 11 times because you are setting state. So every time you are setting state inside use effect, you have one extra re-render. So this is not a good way to do this. So this is a simple calculation. You don't need use effect hook here. So if I want to display full name, I can directly use it here. So every time your component re-render, you have that value of first name and last name. So you don't need this extra use effect hook. So as I typed initially Mike, so let I have not saved that. So when I say Mike, you can see there was 11 times render. So now let me save this. I have removed this and I am directly displaying first name last. So when I type Mike, you can see you have only 6 times re-rendering. So previously it was 11 times. So for every character type, you are setting state, your component is re-rendering. So this is a better way rather than writing use effect. So if any time you are setting state inside use effect, you have one extra re-render. So you should avoid writing use effect and directly use any of the calculation. You can also store that in a variable and you can use that. So I can say full name equal to this and I can use this full name here. So I don't need this extra state. So using extra states is also not good. So as you add more state, you have more re-rendering. So when you declare state, you have to set that state. So when you set state is set, your component will re-render. So you should avoid extra states and avoid extra use effect because you have one extra re-render. So now if I change here Mike Jackson, you can see you have exact same result and you have very less rendering. So you should always do direct access. So if you can derive state, it's always better than declaring a new state just to find out when first name changes, when last name changes, then you are. So here we have added one dependency. You can add multiple dependency as we have seen here. So whenever the first name changes or last name changes, your this function will get executed. So you can add as many dependency as you add as you want, but use effect you should avoid writing extra use effect. So that's it for today. Any question?
Yes. So use effect, when we are not adding dependency, it will always get called once, right?
Yes,
Uh,
first time when
uh,
the component is rendered.
Okay, and in that case, we don't need to write that return function, right? Because there is no
Return function
dependency.
is optional. You don't need return function. Anytime whenever you declare use effect, you don't need return function. But if you are doing some event listener, you are adding, you are setting some interval, then you need to clear that interval
Okay, in
before
that case.
executing that. So in that case, you add this cleanup function.
Okay. And what is the real-time usage of this use effect in our applications? I mean,
This is good useful when you want to make API call. So I want to get list of users initially when the component is loaded. So at that time you use component did mount in class component,
right.
and here you use effect without any dependence.
Okay, only
That,
once we
yes,
need to display some data like that.
yes. So when I want
Okay.
to get all the list of users initially itself, you just declare use effect without any dependency. So that code will execute only once.
Okay. Okay.
Any other question?
No.